Alrighty, folks, what's going on? This is Matt here for Dark One Linux Tech and Game, where is the fusion of Linux technology and gaming. And we are taking a look at a video from Learn Linux TV. And this is about switching to Linux question mark. Here's the pros and cons. This one kind of caught my interest as I was scrolling through my recommended, because, algorithm. The one that caught me was that it was a Linux channel talking about the pros and cons. Now, there's not a lot of them that actually do this because a lot of them tend to be the evangelical type when it comes to Linux. They're the evangelist. It's a religion. It's and not a tool. Whereas a lot of people in that end of the spectrum don't tend to really look at the cons. They just look at the pros and only see it from a philosophical point of view, and that's it. Not from a pragmatic or a practical point of view. So I'm curious to see what somebody like Learn Linux TV will be talking about as far as the pros and cons of this. So let's roll into it and see what they've got to say.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Learn Linux TV. In this video, what I'm going to do is talk to you guys about switching to Linux. I'm going to bring up the pros and the cons when it comes to the migration process, some of the things that you can expect along the way, and also sometimes it's about managing your expectations. But before we get to that, though, I need to make you guys aware of the fact that I have two brand new courses available over on Udemy. First, if you're in the process of learning Linux for the very first time, you should definitely check out my Linux Essentials course. Not only will this course teach you everything you need to know to get started and learn the basics of Linux, it's also going to help you get certified and earn your Linux Essentials credential through LPI. And the Linux Professional Institute is the world's largest Linux and open source.
Now, normally there have been people I've ragged on in the past about in-space sponsorships. I'm not going to rag on that. I am going to skip here a little bit. So don't mind me while I get past this.
If you see your state, you can register online to vote right now. It only takes 2 minutes.
Oh, God.
When it comes to switching to Linux, well, let's talk about it.
Meat and potatoes.
First,
now.
Let's begin with the pro. If you switch to Linux, your hardware will be unrestricted by licensing. And I wanted to start with this because this was one of the main reasons why I switched to Linux in the first place. Now, I told this story a few times in the past, but around the time when Windows XP was the most current version of Windows, that's what I was using at the time. And being a tweaker, I just love to reinstall the operating system and just, try to squeeze as much performance out of my computer as I could. And that was important because I was quite poor. My computer was just not all that great. Anyway, at the time, I didn't have an internet connection or a phone. If I wanted to use the internet, I just used the internet at the college. I didn't really need internet at home at all. So what I used my computer for was just to game. I love to play games, and that's what I did. Now, one day when I reinstalled Windows XP, it wouldn't even let me use my computer because I needed to activate. Now, I don't have an internet connection, so what I had to do was write down the activation code, a long series of characters, onto a piece of paper. And then I, walked down to a payphone, because again, I didn't have a phone, and I used the 1-800 number to get the activation key from the Microsoft automated hotline. And then after writing that down, I walked back in the freezing November cold, walked back into my house, and I was able to activate Windows and I was good to go. But the thing is, I wondered, why am I asking permission to use my own computer? But the thing is, when it comes to Linux, you don't have to ask permission to use your computer. Sure, there is such a thing as Linux distributions that are available for a licensing cost. They do exist, but for the most part, the majority of distributions can be downloaded for free, and you don't have to, purchase a license or activate anything. You simply install it and you're good to go. So you cut that middleman right out of the equation. It's your computer, your rules, and finally, you don't have to deal with licensing.
So, okay. Now, normally I'm not a big fan of the it's free stuff, but what he's talking about specifically and where he's coming from is from a control aspect of your hardware and your software. This is kind of my bitch with Apple. This is my bitch with Microsoft's current trend. Like, I have a 2019 16-inch MacBook Pro that has Mac OS 15, whatever, Sequoia. Probably the last one that Apple is ever going to give that. Hardware is still perfectly good. Apple just don't want to support it no more. At least with a Linux distro, as long as the hardware requirements are met, it doesn't care. As far as the baseline, like, OS needs are met to get it to run, Linux doesn't give a shit. And that's kind of what he's talking about. You know, Microsoft is also guilty of this with like their Windows 11 debacles. It's almost as bad as Vista with, like, you know, need TPM. Like, seeing hardware that is very capable of running Windows 11 being unsupported is ridiculous to me. I mean, Christ, I had an old Elite book that I guess technically would be Windows 11 compatible because it had TPM, but like, just some of the requirements of these guys is what he's talking about. And the fact that Linux gives you that option to control how long you want that hardware supported, how long you want to use that hardware, if you decide to fix that hardware, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that is all not interfered by licensing like you normally get, and is determined by third-party people that aren't you. So control is really what he's talking about, not just the philosophical mumbo jumbo evangelist bullshit that, you know, they're going to want to talk about.
Next, to even this out, let's talk about a con of switching to Linux. And that is, if you switch to Linux, you'll find that vendors don't develop software with Linux in mind, only as an afterthought. And at first, this might be a bit misleading. You'll hear Linux users tell you things like, Linux works on everything, it installs on everything. Well, that's just simply not true. The thing is, a Linux distribution is, well, an operating system, and just like all other operating systems, it's not going to be compatible with everything. Now, taking that out of the equation, if we look at hardware vendors and even software vendors, what you'll find is that Linux is an afterthought. So if we take the hardware equation out, we still kind of have a software problem, but we also have a hardware problem because often hardware drivers aren't made available for Linux as well. Now, at first, that makes it seem like Linux is just not something that you can use. I mean, if hardware vendors ignore it, then why even use it? But the truth is, Linux has the best hardware compatibility of any operating system on the planet. But the problem is, and this is where people run into a problem, very popular pieces of hardware like GPUs, Wi-Fi cards, and even some network cards may not work on Linux. And it's not Linux's fault. It's just that the developer or the vendor that hardware didn't QA it for another platform. I mean, if you think about it, you'll have the exact same experience if you try to get macOS running on Windows. There's a specific type of hardware for each operating system. And again, Linux is really good about hardware. I don't want to paint the picture that everything is bleak. It's just that a lot of people really care about GPUs, and a lot of people really care about Wi-Fi as well. And those two things really just tend to be a sticking point. But if you choose hardware that is known to work with Linux, for example, if you buy a GPU and you research Linux compatibility first, and you also research Linux compatibility first when it comes to your Wi-Fi card, you'll have a much better experience. However, the problem is a lot of people don't test things first, and they make an assumption that if they buy a piece of hardware, it's going to work, probably because another Linux user told them that Linux works with everything, just to find out that it doesn't. So you'll have to keep in mind that some vendors out there just really have poor Linux support, and you'll have to know what does and doesn't have good Linux support before you buy it.
Yeah, there's a degree of support from official support. Let me rephrase how I word this. That you're not going to get sometimes from the official OEMs, from a driver level or software support level, et cetera, et cetera. I will caveat that with saying that there are other like native developed applications and that kind of stuff that will get you mostly there. And, like as an example, there's really not anything like NVIDIA Broadcaster or the GeForce Experience stuff on Linux as it is for NVIDIA. That's just kind of what it is. So like there's certain pieces where he is totally right. But if you're just talking broom horsepower on like your NVIDIA GPU for insert AI thing or gaming, you'll get most of the gaming stuff. A lot of the DLS stuff works for DLSS stuff and the FrameGen, and a lot of that stuff works on Linux through Proton that I've seen, at least for me personally. RTX seems to be pretty good at the moment, but still hit or miss. So like generally you're not wrong. Like what he's talking about is more of kind of out of the box experience. And the thing that I really do appreciate what he's saying is he's talking about the overselling of the experience and the underwhelming experience that you will have from the oversell. And when people say everything works, it might work, but it's also the same thing because we've seen it with like Windows on the deck originally. If it's not supported like officially, like Valve was like, yeah, it's kind of afterthoughty with it. The experience of Windows on the deck was fucking terrible. He mentions Mac OS on a PC, Hackintosh in it. Not wrong. P-lists and all the other fun stuff that goes involved in that. Not the most fun experience there either. So it's weird when something's designed to run on something, it works really well. But sometimes the official support can be very questionable. Kind of the best example is like I think it's OpenRazor. So you have things like polychromatic and that kind of stuff that supplant and substitute a lot of the Razer Synapse stuff that is in Linux. Piper deals with a lot of like your gaming mice and like API and all that kind of stuff. Core control is another thing for like your CPU / GPUs that are AMD. That'll give you your closest to the Adrenalin stuff, but it doesn't have a lot of the kind of nicety features that you would get with some of the Adrenalin, or like the kind of the replay stuff and a lot of the other stuff that they do. So again, it depends really what you're looking for. Again, kind of, I get the con and I understand the con, and I preach that con that don't oversell the experience, but I don't also think we want to undersell the experience too much either. We just want to be realistic. But I do appreciate him talking about that oversell of the experience and kind of underwhelming on the delivery. We do that far too often.
Now let's talk about a pro when it comes to switching to Linux. If you switch to Linux, you'll find a lot of customization options. In fact, the Linux operating system platform has more customization than any other platform. If you can think it, chances are you could probably do it. Now, unfortunately, sometimes all of that customization can be quite overwhelming to newcomers. I mean, just imagine if you log into an operating environment and you see a bunch of buttons, sliders, and toggles all over the place. You'll probably not really know what you're doing, and some people might be afraid of touching certain things if they're, a beginner when it comes to computing, for example. I think having a lot of customization options is a great thing, but some people might see it as a negative. That said, when it comes to Linux, we have all kinds of options, and some of which you probably weren't even aware that they would be options in the first place. I mean, for example, if you use Windows or Mac OS, then you use the Windows UI or the Mac OS UI. Sure, you could change the wallpaper, the color gradients. They do let you change things, but really not all that much when it comes to or is compared against Linux. When it comes to Linux, we can actually change the entire desktop environment, the entire GUI. So imagine logging into Mac OS, for example, deciding that you hate the UI and downloading a different one with it still being Mac OS underneath. That's kind of how Linux works. We have Linux, and then we have the desktop environment or the user's GUI layer on top of that. And we can manage that or, take that out and replace it with something else at will, which gives us a lot of flexibility. So what that means is that if you hate the UI of the Linux distribution that you decided to choose, there's other ones out there. But again, All of this choice and customization might be a negative to people that really just want a more standard direction. Next.
So customization is always a touchy subject with the Linux users, because you're talking predetermined experience, which is what you get from Windows or Mac OS, etc., or kind of the free for all that you can get with certain Linux distros. I am of the mindset that consumer focus and facing distros, those that focus on the pointy clicky aspect of the new users and demos, and like people who just use computers as tools and that's all the fuck they are, that to me is where a predetermined package of stuff that they ship as is totally fine. I think that's a realistic point of view to take, because that's the demo that those people are going after. And that's the demo that buys or ships or, whatever supports that experience. And that's totally fine. The thing that is nice is you can, like what he's talking about, you can expand beyond that predefined experience if you so decide. Whereas in Windows and Mac OS, generally you kind of like hack eye things like, so I don't know if it's still a thing, but like Startup Windows blinds and a few, like you kind of had to hack around in order to get things to do things outside of the scope that Microsoft or Apple wanted you to do or let you to do. Linux, as far as the GUI, Linux really doesn't care. As an example, like I'm a KDE guy, but generically, besides a few minor tweaks, because I used Unity for so long, most of mine is pretty much stock. Like I use a pretty stock Garuda experience for the most part. Like all I do is I shift the panel on the top to the left, because that's just, and I change a menu, and that's how I use Linux in general. Like it is very, and I move the minimize the title bar buttons. Those are to the left, but Garuda ships that to the left anyway. And the thing that the customization I've found allows, though, it's kind of like what I found on Android. Not so much now with kind of the predefined experiences that it kind of gives you. Most people usually don't do a lot of it. But originally, what I loved about Android is that same level of customization, because you could make it your own. Like you could just kind of do what you will with it. So for me, like what he's talking about is I found my workflow with just a few small tweaks, and it's partially because I was a Unity user, partially because I was a Windows user. I've been a multi-monitor user for a long time. So like certain workflow things you develop and you can tweak, and kind of once you get that tweaked, and it's really hard to go back into certain things. Like I had to hate when I have to boot up this thing and to go into Windows, because it is so like 180 of where I normally go. Same with Mac OS. When I fire up the MacBook, it's just like bash my head on the wall, because my workflow and my muscle memory has to adapt to their predefined experiences, whereas I can't shift their predefined experience to my workflow. Whereas Linux allows me to have a predefined experience, but I can switch it to what I find as a better workflow. So that customization, again, pro and con. So I definitely get what he's saying.
Next, let's move on to a con when it comes to switching to Linux. If you switch to Linux and you're a gamer, you'll find that unfortunately not as many games are made available for Linux when compared to Windows. And this is a good example when it comes to managing expectations. That's something that I brought up near the beginning of this video, and I feel that that's key. We have to have good or, reasonable expectations when we're switching to a different platform. And the thing is, if you're a gamer, then unfortunately Linux is okay right now. It's actually in a pretty okay place, but there's just a lot more to go. So you might find that some of your favorite games just aren't made available. And the reason why I bring up managing expectations here is because it's not the fault of Linux when it comes to the games not being made available often for Linux. That's the fault of the developers. They have no excuse at this point because there's so many different libraries, toolkits, and ways to develop games that it's never been easier than it is right now to develop a game for Linux. But still, developers just stay in their old habits and they continue to do things that they've always done them. Not that there's anything wrong with the way that they were doing things, but there just really isn't all that much incentive for them to try and approach another platform. Now, some people might say that Linux is horrible because you have to have good games to get traction in the market, but that's simply not true. Now, it is true that when it comes to gaming, you have to have games to get traction in the gaming market. So obviously, a platform that has fewer games than Windows is not going to do a good job competing against Windows in that market. But that's not the only place where Linux is used. Some people don't play games. So if you're an individual that isn't really into games, or maybe you're more into console games, then in that case, you probably really don't care about this. Now, if you're a big time gamer, you care a lot about this, and chances are you'll probably need to keep a Windows partition around for a little while longer until the situation changes. Now, getting back to managing expectations, it's silly to be upset with Linux when it comes to games not being available on Linux. Again, that's not the fault of Linux. And Linux doesn't suck just because there aren't games available. Sure, it might suck for a gamer, but for the rest of us, it's totally fine. And there's also some really cool workarounds like Play on Linux, Lutris. There's also Steam. There's built-in Proton compatibility now that works very well. So there's a lot of great technologies that are making this better than ever before, and it's only going to get better from here. But again, if you're a gamer, you might be keeping Windows around just a little bit longer.
Okay, so the gaming thing for Linux, he is right about managing expectations. Stupid ads. He is right about managing expectations. However, the thing that I never, and this is what kind of irks me, is I never hear these guys talk about, he mentions about switching OSs and all that kind of stuff. I never hear them talk about the problem you're going to have with Mac OS. I own a Mac. I've done Steam on Intel-based Macs. If you run a 64-bit and 32-bit anything, good fucking luck. The Steam options for Mac OS are fucking worse off than Linux was 5 years ago, before Proton. It is atrocious. It is fucking terrible. And Mac never gets any flack about that. Well, you never buy a Mac to game. Most people would say you want to buy a Linux to game. Go buy a fucking Steam Deck. What do you use it for? You use it to fucking game. The reality is it's dependent on the games that you care about. That's the reality. There are more and more, not all, more and more multiplayer games that require EAC and BattleEye and all these stupid anti-cheat softwares that 90% of the time never fucking work anyway. That supposedly they do. Those are the ones that can be problematic. However, as I have found recently, like day one, I bought a Sword Art Online Fractured Data Dream. Uses EAC. Guess what? I can play it, use it, works fine. Starship Troopers Extermination, EAC. Love it, play it, works great. First Descendant, works. So like the options are there. And that's kind of the reality. Now, those that do not allow Linux to run Destiny 2, Fortnite, those kind of things, that is strictly on the developer/publisher and not the fault of the OS. And I would defend that fact if it was a Mac or a Windows system as well. That is nothing but the developer and solely on the developer. So I would say the gaming situation is good for the DIY build your own console type right now. It is far better than you'd get on a Windows system, and the breadth and availability of games you can play is going to far outweigh anything you can play on these fucking boxes here. And that's the reality. If you build your own Linux gaming PC or whatever, and that kind of stuff. So if you want a console game, I would honestly tell you, get a mini PC with a dedicated GPU. You know, I got a Minis Forums HX 90. I think it's HX 99. Smaller than this damn thing. Dedicated GPU and everything. Stick Bazide on it. Stick Chimera OS on it. Run away with your games. Still going to have more access to Sling games, despite this having a library and that and all that stuff. The library I have on this dwarfs it. So, again, relative to what you game with and what your gaming of choice is.
Sorry to interrupt my own video, but I just wanted to let you know that I appreciate each and every single one of you, and I love creating Linux-related content for you guys. But unfortunately, producing high-quality Linux content like this isn't cheap. But if you want to help me make even more content for you guys, then consider supporting Learn Linux TV. And a great way to do that is to check out the official shop for Learn Linux TV, which was just recently updated. Inside the shop, you'll find distro-themed shirts, bags, drinkware, and more. And there's some other surprises there as well. For example, I've just introduced a mousepad that doubles as a Tmux cheat sheet. How cool is that? So check out the shop at merch.learnlinux.tv, or you could check out the merch shelf right here on YouTube. You could get yourself something really cool and support Linux learning at the same time, so it's a win-win. Anyway, thank you guys so much for your support. I really appreciate it. Now, let's get back to the video. Next, let's bring up a pro when it comes to switching to Linux. If you're a developer, you're going to love it. The thing is, the Linux platform is easily the best platform for developers, period, and it's not even close. Sure, macOS is pretty good too, and there's all kinds of great tools available for macOS, and developers do love macOS. But when it comes to Linux, development is at its core. It's at the core of what it is. Development tools are easily made available. It's part of the architecture and even the ecosystem of Linux to make development tools easily obtainable. And if you're a developer, then I think it's a great platform. And again, I think it's the best platform. Now, that's not to say that just because you're a developer, you're automatically going to have a great time. Don't get me wrong, there is a learning curve, and that learning curve will disrupt your workflow. I mean, that's just the way it goes. When you change from one platform to another, you have to learn that platform, right? And the process of learning a platform is disruptive. It always will be. It's frustrating. It's always going to be frustrating. You just have to get through it. But what I think is the case is that after you get through it, you'll find that you'll love it, because if you're a developer, all of the development tools that you'll ever need access to are right there at your fingertips. For example, if you install Fedora, it's a great Linux distribution, you have the ability to spin up VMs right there inside Fedora without doing anything else. It's literally built in. And that's just one example. There's distributions that do a good job, a not so great job. It really just depends on the distribution. But if you're choosing a primary, popular distribution, Linux Mint, Ubuntu, Debian, Fedora, and a number of the more popular ones, then you're going to have a great time as a developer with Linux. Next is time for
development. Like, that's its whole thing. Like, the whole base start of Linux was developed as a Minix clone, essentially Minix/Unix clone. Nothing big, quote unquote. And so it was always a development cornerstone to its overall building and architecture, and et cetera, et cetera. A lot of the tools are available for Linux. Again, but it depends on what you develop. It's kind of like gaming. It depends on your choices of gaming. Linux, it's very much, what's your language? What's your IDE? What's, is it Vim? Is it Nano? Is it blah, blah, blah? Like, insert dumb argument for those here. But at its core, yes. And the original build of Linux was and still is about development.
for a con. And unfortunately, this is a big one. And the con at this point in the video is the Linux community. Seriously. Linux community. What am I going to do with you? Here's the thing. The Linux desktop is very far along. There's a few rough edges here and there, things that may not work as well as on other platforms, but for the most part, basic usage, it's there. It's totally there, and it's a great platform, but it still could go a little bit further. And what's holding it back is, surprisingly, the Linux community. The problem is there's a lot of infighting within the Linux community. And when you have developers that are working, they're donating their time to help develop these things. They don't get paid for this stuff often. So the fact is they're donating their time. And if the project is divisive in any way, then there's going to be, some arguing about it. And sometimes the developers, in my opinion, they're just not going to be as motivated to develop for Linux as they would be if we, treated them better, I guess. I mean, at this point, you could have somebody that tries to donate time to make systemd better just for somebody to say, I hate systemd. Why did you do that? I mean, that's literally the type of, environment that we're in right now. And I don't want to make it out to be that all Linux communities are bad. There's many great ones out there. It's just that in general, there's some infighting within the community, and I really do feel like it holds Linux back.
So I'm of two minds of this because I also, I don't want to say feed that sometimes, but I am very pragmatic, and I tend to hate the kind of religious lean a lot of the Linux community takes, that very Richard Stallman kind of approach. It doesn't do well generally to sell Linux as a product and not a community, because I view distros, I view projects, I view them all, every single one of them, as a fucking product or a piece to the product. And that's why my take is a little bit different and leans a little bit different, because I'm looking to get Linux users from the other side that don't use it currently to use it, but also tempering the expectations. But I'm also critical of Linux as well, and the areas that it needs to improve on. The infighting over, and this is a pro and con of kind of the open nature of the development of Linux. A lot of this is stuff you'd see in Slack and other kind of private channels like Discord and that kind of stuff. If you were on a normal development platform, I guess would be the best way to put it, or the big development platforms like Windows or Mac OS, you wouldn't see a lot of these debates and stuff. You would see them like they'd be more internal at Microsoft or Apple, but not necessarily out for everybody in the world to see, as it is in Linux. So we have to take a mindset of, if we're going to compare everything across the board, some of these super technical discussions are probably ones that happen at the companies of the competition. Ours are just open and transparent for everybody to see sometimes. However, what I will say is that, yes, the community can shoot itself in its own fucking foot quite goddamn frequently. Constructive criticism. There is such a thing. Like what you mentioned, it's like, oh, systemd sucks. Cool. Okay. Can you fucking elaborate on why you think it sucks from a technical point of view? If not, politely fuck off. It's the same thing. It's like sysv versus systemd. And then, just so many, KDE versus GNOME. And I'll be the first to admit, I will be the first one to rag on GNOME as a project and a product, top to bottom. I will rag on Elementary OS. I will rag on stupid decisions that Ubuntu or Canonical has made. But I'll also rag on stupid decisions that Arch makes. I'll rag on stupid decisions and aesthetic choices that other distros make. At the end of the day, I at least try to give the pro with the con, much like this list that he's doing, constructive criticism about it. Like, example, personally, I'm not a Linux Mint guy. There's a lot of personal choices that they make, and a lot of bitch fits that they do that I don't like. It doesn't stop me from recommending Linux Mint. So there's these weird like disconnect where the infighting is public, the criticism is public, and the criticism a lot of the times is just not good criticism because there's no brevity to the criticism. There's no reasoning with the criticism. Well, System D sucks because it's too big. Okay, Linux kernel's too big? Like, I mean, take your pick. Like actual technical merit to the discussion is super helpful. And if you're just a Joe Schmo end user, you're not going to fucking care if System D is too big or if it plays in too many slots and all the other stuff. You're just not going to care. Again, System D is just the one that he used, and it's kind of the piggyback that a lot of people argue over. But yeah, the infighting can get kind of really petty and unhelpful. But I think a lot of it is because it's public, and a lot of those discussions and probably arguments that happen in our public space probably happen in the private closed spaces of Slack and that stuff at Apple and Microsoft. To be fair, though.
Next, let's return to optimism and talk about a pro. And the pro that I'm going to talk about right now is the fact that there's all kinds of distributions available. There's a bunch of them. Now, that might be a con to some people because, well, sometimes choice can be overwhelming. Sometimes people just want to be told the direction they should go or be recommended. And having a choice of 100 distributions on DistroWatch, that really doesn't make it any easier for anyone. But actually, believe it or not, it's a pro, and here's why. If you download Windows or Mac OS, you pretty much have to use it as the vendors gave it to you. Again, they do let you customize it. I'm not going to say that either platform has zero customization because that simply would not be true. But there's not as much, customization when compared to Linux, but also there's a lot of variations of Linux. I mean, there's different distributions, and a distribution of Linux is a different collection of software. So you could have a different desktop environment, GUI, so you have a different UI for the user on one compared to the other. Maybe you have one distribution that prefers a different Office suite or something. Every distribution is a collection of software. And the reason why this is good is because for each person out there, I think there's a distribution that works for them. They just have to find it because so many people have created distributions that it's very common that somebody will find one that works for them because chances are somebody's already thought of the workflow that it is they intend on using. So it's a good thing to have all these different distributions, even though it might seem overwhelming. My recommendation is just to install Ventoy. It's an application you can install on a flash drive. And if it's a large flash drive, you could just, set up a bunch of Linux distributions on that. I have a video that shows you how to do that. And what you could do is actually use this to your advantage. What you could do is, load the Ventoy full of distros, boot from one of them. If you don't like it, shut it down, and remove that distro from the flash drive. Start your computer up again, try another one, and just keep comparing them and deleting the ones that you don't like until you only have one left. And then chances are that's the one for you.
So here's my thing with like the too many distros argument. It all depends on the demographic. Chimera OS is not a general purpose OS. Despite having a desktop, its primary focus is gaming and handhelds and console-like gaming on PC. That's, what is Steam Fork or whatever the hell the new one is, or old versions of HoloISO. Insert thing here. There are purpose-built distros for specific demographics. Then there are general purpose distros built for general purpose use. Now, while you can make every distro a general purpose use, the start and the core of them and their intended use and built and primary demo all differ, generally speaking. This is where people like Chris Titus and other jackoffs that don't get this part, that, distros don't matter. They fucking do to the demographic they cater to, you fucktard. So I get what he's saying. As far as like the distro choice being good, because it is, because that means there's more choice for distros and demos, etc. Because just because I want to use, say I set up a HTPC, but I don't want to, why am I going to use Chimera OS? Its focus is gaming. Yeah, I can install Kodi on it, or I can go use LibreElect. There's purpose for a lot of these distros that seem to fly above a lot of the uber technical, and I use certain people's technical question their skill there. They cater to very specific demos. And a lot of people don't understand that. Because if you view them as products and within a particular demo, and you understand that that's what they're targeting, a lot of the distros make a lot more sense. Example, I use Garuda. I could do the Archway in the right way. I fucking don't, because A, I enjoy my time. B, what the fuck do I gain personally? And C, Garuda sets everything up for me in a pointy clicky fucking interface. And 20 minutes, I'm done, up and running, and away I go. And the changes I have to make to get to the workflow I need is about another 5 minutes total of what I described earlier on how I change up my workflow from the default Garuda. Whereas if I'm doing it the right way, it is much longer, and I'm left questioning, what did I gain? The knowledge is cool the first time. After that, I just don't fucking care. It's knowing what the distro's purpose is. And that a lot of the times, those pointless distros are aiming at a different demo than the primary distro they're based off from. And I'm glad he recognizes that the choice is good. And that a lot of the times, there is a reason to have that many choices of distros. I'm not going to say it can't be overwhelming, but I do like the fact that he acknowledges it's actually a strength, despite what a lot of the bigger, quote unquote, knowledgeable people that use Linux on YouTube would say.
Next, let's move on to a con when it comes to Linux. The thing is, Linux has a false impression of being a perfect operating system, and I really hate this because I feel like some of the backlash when it comes to Linux is because of some people floating it and just bragging about it and putting it on this pedestal that I just don't think that it should be on. Now, I do think Linux is a great platform and you should check it out, but I won't tell you that it's perfect. That's up for you to decide. But the thing is, some users out there, they pitch it as the best thing ever, the best thing that was ever created, a perfect operating system, but there's no such thing as perfect software. So anytime somebody tells you software is perfect, well, that's already a red flag. So I bring this up as a con because I want to make sure that I'm letting you guys know that Linux is not perfect. Yes, it could be the best platform for you and you'll probably love it, but I also don't want to, make your expectations so high that Linux can't possibly live up to it. And I think that's what a lot of people do. When they brag Linux up even more so than it deserves, then people are kind of let down by that when they find out it's not going to do all the things that they were told that it would do. But anyway, just make sure you take Linux at face value and you should be fine. Now what I'm going to do is end on a pro. And I think this is the biggest pro of all.
So what he's talking about is very accurate. So there is no fucking perfect OS. Windows is terrible. Mac OS is terrible. Linux is every iteration of Linux, Android, iOS, whatever. They're all terrible, just in different ways. Some similar, some not. Yeah, et cetera, et cetera. Example. Surface Book 2. I would love Linux on this. But the experience, there's too many paper cuts for Linux on this. So it's running Windows. However, on the same note, this is the Minisforum V3 Ryzen 8840U, 32 gigs, terabyte SSD, 780M. Windows is 11 fucking atrocious on this. Terrible. God awful. Terrible. Bad. Don't use it. Don't do it. Didn't even survive first boot. That's how I feel about Windows on touchscreen devices after having other devices that run Windows on those, that size screen. Garuda, fan-fucking-tastic on it. Keyboard works. Everything works out of the box. No headaches. again, it's manage your expectations. Understand that while Windows wasn't great on this, and there's still issues on this, like there's a volume issue that I have to fix on this manually when I first got it, tried and figure that out. But and then like Linux on this, like there's I think it's Surface for Linux, or Surface Linux, or Linux Surface, or whatever it is on Reddit. There's an entire GitHub specifically related to these devices, and you have to install the kernel. Like, cool, whatever, that doesn't bother me. But like, the experience on it is very hack-eyed and you could tell it's I don't want to say thrown together, forced to make work is probably the best way to put it. Running the terminal command to make sure I can eject the screen, and when I push the button every time I reboot, is kind of annoying. So it makes Linux not a great experience on it. It's fair. Again, he's talking about overselling and under-delivering, and that's something we do constantly. But there is no perfect OS. They all suck in different fucking ways. And before anybody else thinks I'm not truthful about what hardware I have, 16-inch MacBook Pro. And honestly, out of all the OSs, Mac OS probably pisses me off the most, me personally. But at the end of the day, they all have their pros and cons. Which one has more pros that outweigh the cons for you is really the question.
You're going to love it. Seriously. When you switch to Linux, you're going to have a ton of fun. You're going to learn things that you never even knew about computers, good things. I'm not saying you're going to be overwhelmed unless you try a more advanced distribution. Don't do that. But as long as you make an informed choice when it comes to the distribution, then I think you're going to have a ton of fun. Just take your time. That's the main thing. Take your time. And if you start to feel discouraged or frustrated, just walk away from Linux for a little bit. It's not worth losing it. If you just keep going, even when it doesn't feel comfortable, you might get burned out. It's okay to take a break, put it on the back burner for a little bit, go about your business and your workflow, and then at some point come back to it and maybe it'll work out better. You just have to take care of yourself first, and that's important. But again, the main pro when it comes to Linux is that it's a ton of fun, and I think you're going to love it. And with that said, there's our video. I hope you...
Okay, now that he's done everything, without the outro, I have no real issues with kind of what he's overall saying. From probably nitpicks, but 99% of what he's talking about is very level-headed and evenly approached, I think, which is something we don't get a lot in Linux, and a lot of Linux content. Oversell, under-deliver experience tends to be what we sometimes do on the Linux community. And, I've been guilty of this too. Sometimes, I don't want to say I've always tried to keep a realistic experience, but sometimes your biases do come out, as far as, despite how much you try to keep them in check, that sometimes it just happens, and it's like, you'll be doing it. Like for me, I know, people will say that I'm a Steam Deck fanboy, as an example. Ironically, I don't own a Steam Deck anymore. What I am a fan of is a non-shitty user experience, and the Steam Deck, compared to the competition at the time, which was Windows-based, was better. That's just the reality. It had nothing to do with the actual OS. It was just, like, from a functionality point of view, it had to do with the OS just being not suited for the device. But it kind of come across as a fanboyism when I start talking about experience as opposed to specs mattering, especially when it comes to a Windows crowd where, specs are the things that sell hardware. The reality is, and for most people, because I take a very much more Mac OS approach of user experience mattering, which is super rare in kind of the Linux land, because we have things like i3 and Enlightenment and other, UDE and all these kind of niche, very niche ways of managing a desktop and interacting with screens and pointers and all the other stuff. So talking user experience with that kind of crowd sometimes super tough because it comes across as like, oh, you're just an aesthetics fanboy. I'm a good user experience fanboy, but they equate it as one when it's really the other. And sometimes with those kind of different approaches, the angle you're coming from, it appears as a fanboyism kind of to an people who don't see it from that perspective or never really view it from that perspective. And sometimes when you're trying to explain that perspective, your examples you give will come across as like, oh, well, this does it better, because that's the equivocal you can give an example of. But that bias of kind of looks better as an example it just comes out looking different and better. Like that's just what it is. And sometimes people take those and your biases will show a little bit about what you view as better. That's all. But overall, pros, cons, I don't have any negative thing to say that he gave. It's super rare to have somebody just kind of say what it is in a much more nicer way than I do. I will be the first to admit I am no ambassador to the Linux community or for the Linux community any way, shape, or form. I'm just a dude with a mic, a voice, and a voice I'm not afraid to fucking use, which annoys a lot of people. And I'm okay with that. Like it, love it, don't like it, don't love it. That's, you don't like the delivery or you want to tone police it. Go be you, bro. As far as me, I like Learn Linux. Good content. I like the fact that he knows how to plug his own content, like with the Ventoy video. I wish to God YouTube would do something with these goddamn ads. It feels like I'm getting to TV. I will give a Learn Linux credit though. There was only 2 for a 20-minute video, so that's actually pretty good in comparison to some of the content I've seen. Overall, A+ on my book. Very fair, very even. What are some of the pros and cons you guys think? Let me know in the comments. Original video will be down in the descriptions. Global Bundle, Indie, Galileo, Patreon, all that crap is in the description as well. And you guys know what to do. I'll catch you on the flip.